Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 25 today with the second half of Abigail's plea to David to relent on his plan to punish Nabal and his family with his 400 armed men who were right there on top of Abigail. So, as we noted last time, Fackelman has shown that this speech is divided equally in two sections, and we looked at the first section last time. Each section involves 11 lines and exactly 71 words in the Hebrew. And as we saw last time with the key words you can see on the right side of the screen, with Abigail falling at his feet, there was this constant repetition of now, now, now in here, and her claims of what Yahweh had done for him. Especially restraining him from blood guilt. And so she's proclaiming that that's what happened here and that's what protected him. And as we looked at last time, we know that Abigail's purpose here is ambiguous. Is she afraid of David and trying to placate him? Is she eager that he's there so she can replace her no-good husband that she described in the strongest possible terms negatively last time with somebody better or something else? It's not clear exactly. And it's also not clear whether her proclamation of Yahweh, we understand that as prophetic, that what she's saying is truly the word of Yahweh, or that she believes it is, but we don't know if it truly is or not, or this is just things she's saying because she thinks it's what David wants to hear. And we don't get to hear inside Abigail's mind at all. We see her acting by gathering the present together, and we see her speaking, but we really don't get inside of her as we sometimes do with David. So that's left open for readers to decide what is Abigail's motivation, and should we trust what she's saying is the truth about Yahweh's intention about David, both in the past and in the future. And if we've read the entire text, we already know that some of what she says is blatantly not true in the light of unfolding events, but we'll have to get there as we go. So we're continuing to note the verbal links between this chapter and the chapters around us. We've also been looking at the relationship with the Jacob and Laban story, but there aren't any particular echoes in these verses here. But there are of chapters 24 and 26. And so here we are now on verse 28. Please forgive the trespass using pesha, and we see in 24 no evil or trespass, and that's the only two times that the word pesha is used in either 1st or 2nd Samuel, so a clear connection there. In verse 29, there's three connections. If a man, the usual word be ish, but here it's Adam, as in the first Adam in Genesis, should rise up to pursue you and seek your life, and we see each of those parts are echoed from chapter 24 and chapter 26. The man urged me to kill you, whom do you pursue, and David seeks to do you harm. So all three of those are echoed, and we'll see this part next time. We're also looking at this chiastic structure of the unit from 22 to 34, and so we looked at this part last time, and now we're in this section here. And as I noted last time, this could potentially be divided into three sections as well, into a C, D, C prime part, but I didn't do that because it's not quite as precise a chiastic parallel as these are. You can see in the blue highlighted parts are almost verbatim identical. So this is setting up the structure for this entire unit, starting with if by morning I leave so much as one who pisses against the wall, his promise to do with an oath that purportedly binds God to it, and here he relented from it. He would have done that if it hadn't been for Abigail's intervention there. So we'll see that all the way through there. And returning again to our key words for our section, we see our section is just replete with repeated words, and I've reposted this on the radicalbible.net webpage a few times because each time I go through I find a couple more things that are often hidden in translation. So both the heart here and a heart earlier are hidden in translation. We looked at this one, put out of your heart, but here no stumbling block of the heart, and there's also Nabal's heart that died there. So that's one that I wanted to emphasize. And there's also a good here. This is dealt well in the new RSV, as we'll see, but there's also this good going on here that's emphasizing that Yahweh has done good, and that David should be good as long as he goes along with this. And the emphasis on Yahweh throughout, and the constant referring to David as my Lord, and herself as a servant. And we saw last time she had shifted her servant language from Amma, which is literally like a slave, to Shikha, which is a marriage-eligible young woman. So setting up what we'll see at the end where she ends up becoming his wife. So with all that in mind, let's enter right into our story, starting in verse 28. So as Barbara Green notes about what we're about to hear, she says, surely a blessing ill-suited to the story we know lies ahead. Abigail here sounds like Hannah of 1 Samuel 2, proclaiming reversals in a triumphant mode, but promising things that will not come to pass at all. And although Barbara Green is narrating obviously on the David story, we might note as well that the Hannah story is also echoed in Luke's Gospel, that Mary's Magnificat, and she promises things there that don't happen as well. So whether Luke is trying to imitate Abigail's speech here, or it's just echoing Hannah, is an interesting question we can get to in our Luke series. So please, emphasizing the please we've seen a number of times throughout here. Please forgive the trespass of your servant. What trespass has she engaged in? She hasn't done anything. And she's already said in the first part of the scene that the guilt be on her, but she didn't know. That David's young men came to Nabal, but she didn't know about it until her young men told her that David's young men had come to them. So whatever she thinks that or saying the trespass is, we don't know. And perhaps she knows there isn't one. Perhaps she's just begging in all the language she can possibly find here to get David to leave her alone. For Yahweh will certainly make my Lord a sure house. Because that comes completely out of nowhere. And that's one of the triplets we've been looking at. We didn't look at it last video, although there was this one here. So I want to bring that up again. We looked at it in the beginning part. These three-part sayings, starting with David's message to his young men to tell Nabal, and 3 times, shalom, shalom, shalom. And we saw these earlier. And so she said at the beginning of her speech that Nabal, in 3 levels, is a man of Belial, so is his name, and folly is with him. And now she says, Yahweh will make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of Yahweh, and evil shall not be found in you as long as you live. All of those are questionable, both in terms of what will happen in the story and theologically, but we'll explore that in a minute. And then we'll see in the next verse, while I have it up here, also another triplet here, to seek your life, the life of my Lord, and the lives of your enemies. So 3 elements of that here. Let's look more closely at what she says here. Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house. Now, the certainly make is another form of the Hebrew doubling a verb, and often it's put things like will make, yes, make. It's almost exactly repeated in verse 30a there. But a sure house, Abaya Nayaman there. And as Bodner notes below, in the stunning prediction, Abigail goes a step beyond the words of Saul in the previous chapter. And then we also hear down here from Shepherd, now in Abigail's words we find the first suggestion that David's inability to avoid illegitimate bloodshed may have adverse implications for his own house. And we'll certainly see more about that when we get to the Uriah and Bathsheba story in 2 Samuel. But as many scholars have noted, this is a jump way ahead to Nathan's promise in 2 Samuel 7 that the house of David will be sure forever. Let's look just at this one verse for a moment there. So this is Nathan saying to David, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me, quoting Yahweh there, your throne shall be established forever. And that's the end of Nathan's vision there. So obviously we as readers don't know about that yet. And Abigail obviously doesn't know about that. Or would you expect that Nathan knows about what Abigail said here? Perhaps David, we can imagine David told Nathan, but there's no particular reason to imagine that. And it's so far out of context here. It's so far ahead of the situation that it really is startling, as our commentators note. A sure house certainly refers to the sense of a dynasty. And we'll see in 2 Samuel, house is a multi-layered play on words, both the physical house of Yahweh, which is to say the temple, but also David's physical house, the royal house that he lives in, but also the house of David in the sense of the dynasty. So we'll see all the layers of that playing out. And certainly she doesn't mean the building here. Certainly she means the dynasty. Even though the promise of monarchy in 1 Samuel 8 had nothing to do with dynasty. It had to do with Yahweh picking someone that the people affirmed. And as Samuel experienced, he chose David in place of Saul, not Saul's son Jonathan, who might well have been a good choice, but that wasn't how it worked. So we have no reason to think that dynasty is Yahweh's will, and yet she's implying that here. And she gives 2 reasons, or gives a reason for it, and then extrapolates something else. Because my Lord, David, is fighting the battles of Yahweh. And that's the reason alone. That phrase is only one other time. Let's look at it there in 18:17. And Saul said to David when he gave his elder daughter Merab, I will give her to you as a wife, only be valiant for me and fight Yahweh's battles. For Saul thought, I will not raise a hand against him, let the Philistines deal with him. And there's a wonderful irony playing out there, because Saul imagines, I don't have to kill my rival David, Yahweh will kill him, or at least the Philistines will kill him, and we can claim that it was Yahweh's doing, or at least the Philistines' doing. So Saul plainly wanted David dead, and sends him out in the front, just as David will send Uriah to the front with the note he takes to Joab to put him there. And so back in our situation, we're echoing the fact that David is wondering, how will Saul be removed from him, since he cut off the corner of his cloak in chapter 24, but is resolved not to do harm to Yahweh's anointed. How would Saul end up being removed out of the way of David's monarchy? And one of those would be that Yahweh would take care of it. And so the echoes back to Saul's dispatching of David to the war in order to let the Philistines kill him is certainly echoing David's wondering about how Saul will die here. But here, Abigail assumes that because he's fighting the battles of the Lord, evil shall not be found in you as long as you live. And furthermore, she'll go down to verse 29 to say, Yahweh will keep you safe. In the end, that is in fact what happens. David doesn't die in battle. He dies of old age in his bed. Is the reason that Yahweh will make him a sure house is because he's fighting the battles of Yahweh? We'll have to see whether that's what Nathan says in 2 Samuel 7. And the idea that evil shall not be found in you as long as you live, or literally in your days or in all your days, is a really questionable thing. Readers have to decide about that, and there are many deaths that occurred that David didn't say, I didn't do it, but he certainly is responsible for the death of Uriah, and no one is going to defend that as anything other than evil. So Abigail is making promises here, or making offers, plainly that, as we'll see, David is enjoying hearing, and who wouldn't enjoy hearing them? Does he believe that this is the word of Yahweh, or does he just believe this is a young woman who's on my side? We don't know for sure. But she's not done yet, not nearly here. So in this verse, recalling 1749 that we'll go back to in a minute, as Fackelman notes below, Abigail shows David that the triangle of God's action, pro-David, contra the enemies, is much larger than the triangle between her husband, and David. At least that's the argument she's making. Whether David buys into that's another question. If anyone, and this is the Adam we saw earlier, should rise up to pursue you, connecting with those verses as we saw only two other times elsewhere in 1 Samuel, to seek your life, and this is 26 times in 1 Samuel, but here connecting as we saw again, your life, and this is nephesh, which is 3 times in the verse, and you see how much there's just repeated language here. It's not quite poetic, but it's certainly circling around itself, and even in English you can see life, living, and lives there. So let's read this carefully, because there's an interesting figure of speech here. So if anyone should rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, and all readers can hear Saul in that, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living. What an interesting phrase uniquely here. Here's the Hebrew for it, sarara bitsara hakayayim. The first word to bind, the first verb means to bind or tie up, and the last one is sora, is a pouch or a bag, and it's described ordinarily as a bag elsewhere. And as my note below has, must be a figure of speech, but we don't know where it's from. As Fackelman, and no one's a closer reader than Fackelman, says, we have no idea of a possible religious background to this idea. So there's this image of all living being bound up in some kind of great bag under the care of your Lord. Your God is misleading here. Under the care is not there in the Hebrew. And other translations, as you can see below, simply have by the Lord your God or with the Lord your God. But it's certainly the sense of being bound in a bundle of the living, of being held together in this bag of living beings. Don't know that anywhere else. But the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling. And there's many levels of laughter and intratextual jokes there. The lives of your enemies will be fulfilled in 2 Samuel 20:22. We won't go to that now. But this was exactly one of the questions that came up, of course, in the previous chapters. And in the next chapter, the question of what happens to your enemies. And so we've seen that earlier here around the question of your enemies. So whereas David's people said Yahweh gave your enemy in your hand in terms of Saul's proximity, Abigail now says God will put the lives of your enemies, God shall sling out. In other words, it's not on you to do it, David, but he will do it with the very weapon that you chose. And this is where the levels of irony and humor go. So this phrase here uses both the noun for sling and the verb here. The only other sling in Samuel is David's sling, where David called upon Yahweh to help him defeat Goliath with stones from a sling, and Abigail offers that Yahweh will directly sling away David's enemies. But it also recalls the fact that David said Yahweh does not win battles with sword or spear. So precisely as David comes down with the swords, presumably to attack Nabal and his men as enemies, she says, the lives of your enemies God shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling. Whether we think of that as Saul or as we think of it as Nabal, we'll find later Nabal will be found dead like a stone, which I think is a lovely play on how Goliath was dispatched with a stone from David's sling, and now Nabal will be dispatched metaphorically with a sling from Yahweh that will leave him dead as a stone. So Abigail's almost done here, but not quite. When the Lord has done to my Lord, to say when Yahweh has done to my Lord, according to all the good he has spoken concerning you. And there's a real question here. All the good he has spoken, to whom? To Abigail? To David? To Samuel? To Saul? To the people? How would we know what she's referring to? And how does she know what Yahweh has said to David? How does she know anything that Yahweh said to David? They've just met. We have no reason to think that Yahweh has spoken to her earlier. So is she just making this up? Is she just imagining these possibilities, assuming that David has some relationship with Yahweh that she can play on, even if she doesn't know what it is? In other words, is she just being a fast on her feet, clever arguer here? We were told she was clever and beautiful, and we may be focusing on the beautiful, but we know that she's clever, and the word for clever, as echoed in Proverbs, can mean, prudent with speech and good with words, as David is also good with words, as we've already seen. So we don't know if this is just rhetorical display here, or if this is meant to be something that she prophetically knows. We've seen she's characterized something like Samuel here, but again, that's left wide open for readers to decide. But then she continues, has appointed you prince over Israel as Nagid. And again, how would she know anything about that? We have no reason to think she knows anything about that. But notice what she's not saying, not appointed you king. And we have to look a little more closely at that. So first at the temporal aspect. She's stating it as an already done deed, and we know it's an already done deed, but again, how does she know? Von Walde discusses the meaning of Nagid, citing Murphy's 1998 book for the special uses of it in the book of Samuel, and she notes this: not to designate a specifically royal function, but to occupy a position ideologically opposed to that of Melech, which is king. He states, that is Murray, that there are two particular features of the notion of Nagidship. First and foremost, the Nagid is a role instituted by Yahweh for the welfare of his people. As such, the Nagid is more than a primus inter pares, which is to say first among equals. Second, the Nagid is not only to be designated by the divine word, but at all times to be directed by it. Something that we hear in Deuteronomy 17 about the king, that this Torah, this word, should be at his side, and he should be reading from it every day. A weaker implicature, I think that's just a fancy word for implication, is that dynastic succession is not a logical concomitant of Nagidship. In other words, a Nagid, prince is a bad translation because prince implies the son of the king, and this simply means something other than a king who's a leader. In fact, sometimes it is simply translated as leader or ruler. But Von Walde goes on, after citing Shepherd there, to say it can preliminarily be translated as someone placed in front of others, and she goes on to speak of a double spatial relationship within the framework of Yahweh as owner and the people of Israel as Yahweh's property. She concludes by moving away from Murray's view as opposed to Melech and saying this: these two leadership terms, which is, say, Nagid and Melech, function in different conceptual domains. Melech refers to the military, constitutional, hereditary leadership reflecting human relationships, whereas Nagid refers to spatial, non-constitutional leadership reflecting the relationship between Yahweh and his people. In other words, the Melech is a formal one in an institutional setting, and Nagid is a personal one here, just among people. And so that's what she's claiming here, if she follows that same understanding that Von Walde is saying is the understanding we get from reading what the writers of 1st and 2nd Samuel take in the overall picture. But it's not king, and that's an interesting element of it here, that she's suggesting that Yahweh has spoken about him being appointed Nagid. And we'll hear that also in 2 Samuel 7, but we'll also hear monarch as king there. Now she's almost finished. So in verse 31, the final one, and many commentators have something to say about this, Falkman notes a warning that an excess of violence committed once would forever mean a shadow over David's royal career. And as my note says, completely counterfactual to the events that follow. But here it serves Abigail, just as Abraham's plea for Yahweh's justice in Sodom in Genesis 19 served Abraham's interest in Lot by appealing to David's inner peace and public reputation. As Samora notes here, this he suggests the translation, this thing should not become to you a tottering, that is a stumbling of heart to my Lord, that is shedding blood in vain. So let's have the key words up here on this section here as we look at this more closely. My Lord shall have no cause of grief, literally a stumbling block of the heart. And the word puka is only here in the Masoretic text, so it's not 100% clear that it's stumbling block, but it's something like that. And the other word, mishkal, is only here in the Deuteromistic history. So lev, of course, is heart, and that's a common word. So grief is not nearly close enough to catching the metaphor that makes heart a key word here, but we also saw it earlier, and we'll see it up here, and we'll see it below again. Or pangs of conscience, this is all the same phrase, for having shed blood without cause or having saved himself. The phrase for without cause we saw earlier in 19:5. Let's look at it there. Here it was without cause. Why then will you sin against an innocent person by killing David without cause? And so it comes back here that Abigail is saying, well, you've been saved from shedding blood against Saul without cause, or for having saved himself, using the Yeshua word for saving, echoing what we heard in verse 26 back here, or it was wrongly translated as vengeance. So here in her early part of her speech, and this is again what may make it chiastic that we hear this in 26 and that echoed down there in 31, has restrained you from seeking deliverance with your own hand. And maybe that's more the point here, not vengeance. It's not about vengeance, it's about deliverance from Saul. It may be vengeance against Nabal, but it's not really about Nabal, it's really about Saul. So to save himself from Saul, he will not shed blood. And that answers the question that he's been asking throughout here is, how will Saul be removed as an obstacle from his monarchy? This is at least what Abigail has to say, and again, we're not sure if that's something that reflects Yahweh or not. So when Yahweh has dealt well, and this is covering over another Yatov here, so has done good with my Lord, then remember your servant. And when would we imagine that is that she's asking to remember? Maybe when he's become king? Well, she's going to become his wife momentarily, and then we never hear from her again. So if he remembers her, we don't hear about it. And that's where we'll stop today as we listen to the end next time to David's response that fills out this chiasm here. And we can hear whether David takes Abigail's word as the word of the Lord or how he responds to that. We'll get to that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.